Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Bill Lamori, and today I'm going to talk about Marilyn Manson. I'm going to talk to you about when I knew him before he was famous and as the band gathered steam and launched into international superstar status, and then what I would say to him if we were to meet again now. Now, what I'm going to offer in this video is neither celebration nor condemnation of Marilyn Manson and his music. There's already tons of places you can go to for videos like that. Instead, I'm going to be recounting the earliest days of Manson, pre-album launch, and share what my time with him and the band was like in that era, talk about some of the things I saw that contributed to their success, and then what I would say to him if we were to meet again right now. Again, you can find lots of coverage on the history of the band and its members, but I think I have something unique to contribute to the conversation. You see, I was actually there from the very beginning. I actually wrote their first interview for a local music magazine in South Florida, and I hung out with the guys regularly, especially with Brian and Brad, aka Manson and Gidget. So I hope what I can do is fill in some of the holes, because I know some of you that might watch this, you're Manson fans, you just want all the information you can get. So I'll share some stories and you might learn some things and actually find out where certain things came from that you didn't know. And hopefully that's interesting to you today. But I also want to disclose, just to put my cards on the table on the front end, that my life changed quite a bit since that time, and I became a Christian and even a pastor. So what I would say at the end of this is you're going to see what would I say to Manson if we were to catch up over a cup of coffee now and sit down and have a conversation. And that part might interest a different sort of viewer, but either way, I certainly hope if you're watching this, you find it interesting. And what I just have one request: if you would take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to continue producing content that is informative, entertaining, or helpful for you in some kind of a way. And actually, I do have a giveaway. I'm going to give away something that belonged to Manson that he gave to me. And I'll tell you about that, how to get that later on. But let's get into it. The day I met Marilyn Manson was August 26, 1990 in Miami Beach. And I know it sounds creepy and stalker-like that I know the date, but it was easy to find that because I met him outside of a Ramones concert that we had both gone to, where he was handing out flyers to the first Marilyn Manson show. And as I talked to him, he just was interesting. And so he gave me this flyer. And the next day, I called the phone number that was on the flyer. To my surprise, he not only called me back, but he asked me for my address. I mean, that was a little spooked, but I did. And then he calls me a few hours later and he tells me to go to a cemetery right across from the street from my house. At this point, I was getting a little bit creeped out, but I went over there because it was still daylight, and I went whatever it was, like he said, 3 rows back and 6 gravestones across, whatever it was. And so I went there, and then I found this interesting thing. It was a plastic bag, and inside there were some disturbing things and a cool thing. There was a decapitated Barbie doll. There were newspaper stories that were clipped out of serial killers and murderers. And underneath all of that was this cassette tape, their very first demo. Now, needless to say, at this point, he had my interest, and I just had to hear what this guy had to say and what it was all about. So I went home and I played the tape, and I have to tell you, I was absolutely blown away. I mean, it was incredible. It was nothing quite like I had heard up to that point. And from that point on, I was in. I'm like, call me in. I'm part of this thing, whatever it is. And so I called him back and thanked him and told him how much I really dug this cassette tape. And then we became friends, or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to overstate my relationship to Manson, but I was around. I saw the band live dozens and dozens and dozens of times. I helped be some of the stage crew and some of the different things, and we just hung out a lot. So whatever it is, I had a relationship and a connection with these guys. And so let me tell you a bit about the scenes at that time, what it was like in that era as Manson began to build his brand of cult-like followers. And then again, I'll fill in some of the blanks that you won't find on Manson Wiki and so forth, including the formation of his bizarre side project, Satan on Fire. But we'll get to that. Let's get to what was the music scene like at the time that Manson emerged. All right, let's talk about the music scene in the United States at the time when Manson launched this band that would soon make him a household name. Now, Al Gore had apparently already invented the internet, but in 1990 it wasn't widely available and used in homes and businesses, and the World Wide Web just wasn't everywhere like it would be in just a few years. Now, narrowing it to the genre, heavy metal had just finished its most glorious decade of the 80s, and grunge, while it was on its way of coming out and just kind of making itself known, it hadn't yet become this monster of a genre yet and taken the kill shot to heavy metal that it shortly would. It was sort of this brief transitionary period where there were opportunities available for bands that weren't stuck to the past, that could see just something to fill this place between what was and what was to come. Now, narrowing this even further to the South Florida music scene, there were some really great local bands that also in this period, many of them were trying to reinvent themselves. You see, it wasn't LA, there wasn't just tons and tons of opportunities to get noticed and tons of bands, but there were some really good ones that were out there trying to make a difference. And again, they were having to adjust their style just a little bit. There were bands like Tough Luck that were actually really good, but as you could see from their documentary, really had some tough luck. There were other bands like Saigon Kick that kind of made it. They got signed, they had albums come out, and yet they had one or two hits, and then the legs just didn't carry them down too far in their musical career for whatever reason. So out of Fort Lauderdale, or Fort Lauderdale as Manson used to call it, Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids emerges. And they quickly gained this cult-like following of rabid followers, and me and a lot of my friends were some of them. People who came to their shows, bought their merch, and rocked out to what the band described as beat up your mom music. And I knew from the very first time that I saw them live that they were destined to be big. It was just inevitable. But I'm not chalking it up to fate. You see, there was, if you study and look behind the scenes, there was a purpose and there was a plan. There was a whole lot of intentionality. So let's talk about how Manson marched forward to infamy, refusing to allow anything to slow him and his progress down. All right, let's talk a little bit about how Manson built the band and the brand. And make no mistake about it, Manson didn't just build a band, he built a brand that was widely copied and influenced many other people. The first thing that I observed that he did was he used smart shock value. Yes, of course there was shock value. I mean, after all, you have to get people's attention, especially when there's other bands to look at around you, and Manson used a lot of shock value. And I saw a lot of that with my own eyes. Of course, how I got my first demo tape, right? That was all part of it. It just wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't have had the same effect if he just came to my house, rang my doorbell and said, "Hello, sir, here is a cassette tape of my demo. Please let me know what you think," right? Everything was very intentional. And by the way, I got to personally participate in a lot of the hijinks. Like the time before one of his concerts on a Halloween night that he and I went to a grocery store and we bought some chicken feet and some gizzards. And when we got to the show, we hung the chicken feet all around the stage and took the gizzards and put them inside of a piñata. And it was a show at a club called the Reunion Room in Fort Lauderdale. Then he hung it up so it was over the crowd. And then midway through the set, he took this cane that he had been performing with for one of the songs. And I remember he said, "Do you want some candy, boys and girls?" Right, in his voice. And then he took the cane and handed it to someone. And then they just started beating it. And I was in the crowd. At that point, I just stepped back because I knew what was to come. And then finally, they successfully breached that piñata, and meat just rained down on the crowd, and it was absolutely vile and disgusting. And there were some skins in the crowd. They saw it, and they took their Doc Martens and they just started stomping on it. So before you knew it, there was this nasty meat paste that was all over the floor, and people were sliding and moving all around and following that. Absolutely disgusting. But word spreads, and people kept coming back to see what was next. But again, it was smart shock value, right? There was things that were thought out. It was calculated, especially compared to other bands that tried to get attention, but it wasn't as smart. Case in point, I hate to talk smack, but there was a local band called The Clowns. No offense if any of you are watching this, and I do wonder what happened. So if you write in the comments, let me know what's going on. That would be great. But let me share an experience that illustrates the contrast between what others did and what I call the smart shock value. You see, one day I went to a local rock shop. It was called Zach's Rock Shop, and he was a wild character. If you know, you know. But at some point, he turns to me. He was talking to all the band members. Most of the guys were there. And he turns to me and he says, "Man, I just love you guys." And I realize he thinks I'm part of the band, which I told him I'm not. But then he finds out that I play guitar, badly, by the way. And he says, "Listen, I'm managing this band called The Clowns, and you have to play with them. You would be perfect. You look the part, and we're doing something totally unique. All the band members have secret identities, and they're hiding it by wearing clown makeup." I said, "Do you mean like Kiss?" He says, No. It's totally different. It's clown makeup." You see, Manson instead did shocking things, but smart things, like whether it was strategies like I described before, or just concepts, even the idea of their name, having the first name of like an iconic supermodel or movie star, and the last name of a notorious killer, not to mention genders mix. It was disturbing. But it was smart. I mean, it grabbed attention. And so, again, you could see what I mean by smart shock value. And again, this is helpful to get you noticed, but it's not enough to take you to the top. That's why there was more than that. Manson worked smarter and harder than any band around. I know you hear some of the stories about maybe what happened later and just getting involved with all kinds of vices, but at that time, that's not what I saw when I knew him. He, at that time, hadn't even really got into hard drugs or any of that. They just kept working hard. They kept writing new material, re-recording old songs till they got better, and the music, the songs all just constantly evolved. And you see, I think he knew that gimmicks grab attention, but substance is what sustains it. And so not only did they keep writing, keep recording, they were constantly playing shows, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, wherever they got an opportunity, and they were always headlining, except when it made sense to open for bands like Nine Inch Nails, when they were able to reconnect with Trent, and you know all that whole story. But they were just constantly playing, and yes, they always had something to talk about, like, "Hey, did you see when Manson had that girl in a cage at the last show?" or whatever it was. But again, the point is they were constantly working, writing, recording, performing, shocking, rinse, repeat. So they had something that was there to grab attention, but they also worked hard at retention. And they also had amazing communication. The communication to fans was top-notch. Remember, as I said earlier, all of this is happening pre-internet. Had Manson had the internet and social media in those days, I mean, it would have been incredible to see. It is ironic because I look and it doesn't seem like he engages much on social media these days. But had he had it then, it'd be crazy. But what he did do is he used the low-tech tools that were around at our time, and he used them in ways that nobody else was doing. For example, the Manson hotline. Manson would record these messages where he'd go on weird rants and then talk about things like new demos or upcoming shows, and it was always intriguing. So people kept calling to see if there was a new message yet. Much like you might refresh a web page, people would just call up and word would get around, "Hey, there's a new message, call up the newsletter." But in addition to the hotline, the Spooky Kid fans could not wait for for their next flyer, which was another way. It was a key part of the communication. And some people actually collect those flyers to this day. And Manson would draw the art that was on these flyers for all their shows. And again, it was with the same smart shock value. I mean, the flyers were filled with pentagrams and pictures of Charles Manson, babies with knives, needles, pills, all kinds of things that were designed to grab attention, shock, offend, and just expand the lore. And I met him when he was personally handing these out, but as time went on, they had other people that were happily willing to do it for them. But the point is, they had a strong work ethic. They worked harder and smarter than all the other bands that I could see. But I think there is at least one more thing I observed that, though controversial at times, helped them advance quite a bit. He made hard decisions. I mean, how many bands or organizations have you seen that are full of talent and potential, but they stall out somewhere along the way because the leader just can't make the difficult decisions about the people and circumstances around them that need to be made that are slowing them down? I got to tell you, this was not a problem for Manson. I saw him constantly changing what needed changing. You see, when I first went to see them live, for example, he used to use a megaphone and scream or sing, whatever you want to call it, into that. But I think he realized at some point that this was just a crutch. And so he made the decision to kind of put that away, except for a song or two, and he began singing natural. Some people never get past their crutches, but he kind of did that early on. Also, early on, I saw a band member replaced by one of the coolest guys around, Brad, aka Gidget Guy, who just looked and acted like a rock star. When you met Brad, you knew he was just going to be one. He wanted to be one. It was pretty much his whole goal in life. So that was a really good addition. Also, when they started, they were somewhat of a psychedelic band thanks to Scott's amazing guitar work, a little bit of an industrial metal band, and they used a drum machine to record and in the live shows. But I think at some point they realized that to get more depth to the band, what they were looking for, they had to eliminate the drum machine to get to the next level. So they added a drummer, Fred, and that changed things. And I believe before that they added Steve, the keyboard player, who brought in lots of samples into the show, and that was a right decision too. It added a lot to it. But I know that making these decisions is difficult because change is hard, but they were willing to make these. Now, on the topic of personnel change, that was tough. They did make a decision later on that was, I think, controversial, at least to the people that were around at the time. It was difficult, and personally it was hard, but I'd have to say it was probably the right thing. You see, they made the decision to kick this same guy, Brad, out of the band that I mentioned after their debut album was recorded, but before it was released. Now, you see, I know Manson back then used a lot of drug imagery, and there's lots of rumors about his drugs and habits later, but again, during this period, he wasn't really into these things, and he didn't want anyone in the band abusing these things and slowing them down. So Brad had been warned. But he relapsed once again. He overdosed, was brought back to life, but woke up in rehab to a FedEx that was delivered to him, informing him that he was kicked out of the band, replaced by local band Ambougalard's bass player, Jordy. He was actually the guitar player, but learned to play bass for the band. But I felt awful because Brad's dreams were finally coming true, but his heroin habit denied him of that. You see, Brad was the guy that I hung out with most besides Manson, got in a lot of trouble with, and stayed in touch with. And I was absolutely crestfallen years later to learn that he had relapsed and died with a needle in his arm. Rest in peace, Brad, my friend. I miss you, and I think of you all the time. But despite my personal feelings, I recognize it was a hard decision. But again, it was probably also a right decision that had to be made, not only for Manson, but for everyone in the band as they were ready to experience some of the success that they had worked so hard for. And of course, the band went on to experience fame, fortune, all of that. But I want to share some of my personal stories to take you behind the curtain a little bit and share what they were like and what the scene was like from my personal experience back then. All right. So what else can I tell you about my experience with Marilyn Manson? Should I tell you how he asked me to write up their first interview for a local magazine called Tonight Today? Should I talk about how I sometimes got to announce them before they came out on stage? Or when I dressed up as characters inside the live performances, like an Oompa Loompa or Thing 1 or Thing 2? I remember fighting with my friend Tommy because he really wanted to be Thing 1. I wanted to be Thing 1. I know, it's the little things. I'm sure to talk about backstage at the shows. And I think right here you could see backstage at the Button South. And check this out. Notice this is from my personal photo album, pre-tattoo sleeves on Brian's arms. Should I talk about and tell you about the time that Manson committed sea monkey genocide? You see, we had gone to the movie theater and we saw this film, Silence of the Lambs. And then afterwards, we were horsing around in the parking lot when he kind of clotheslined me, and all of a sudden, this necklace that I was wearing, they sell these things where you could put your sea monkey family inside a globe and wear it around, and I thought it was cool, but he crushed it, and so all of a sudden sea monkeys died on my chest. Should I tell you about hanging around at his parents' house, or watching movies like Twister with him at his girlfriend's house? Should I tell you about how my online name, which is attributed in the liner notes of one of the demos, came to be? Let me just say that I didn't know what BP stood for at the time, so I made up a story when the gas station started coming around our area and then telling people about it, and that's all that is. Should I tell you about how he went to toy conferences and collections and how he ended up giving me some of his action figures? That actually does remind me about the giveaway. So there's 2 figures that I still have that he gave me, and I am willing to give these away. The first one I'll give away if this video gets 1,000 likes, so there's your incentive and your bribe. And I'll give the second away if it receives 10,000 likes, and if it doesn't, that's cool because I kind of want to keep one. But here is one. It's this pig. I don't really know what he is and what he does, but you can see that's this. This is what I'll give away if we get to 1,000 likes. And the second one, I believe, is a Toxic Avenger. He collected toys like I did, and so there's that. Now, speaking of toys, I'm reminded of, we used to go to toy stores a lot as well. I remember one time we were in Toys R Us, and these are just the things that kind of built the legend and the lore that he did things like this back then. We were in Toys R Us, and there was this little girl, probably 2 years old, in a shopping cart, and her mom went around the corner looking at something. And so I look over, and he leans in real close to her face, eyeball to eyeball, and says, "Are you scared, little girl?" And of course, this girl starts crying and screaming, and we run away. And at the time, as a snot-nosed punk, I thought it was hilarious. As a dad of 3 girls now, I'd probably want to deck him, but these are some of the things that just would happen back then. But let me finally get to that story I promised about the origin of Satan on Fire. One day, me and Manson were driving around from Christian bookstore to Christian bookstore in Fort Lauderdale, buying up these Jesus action figures and then turning them into Charles Manson figures. Sorry, that's just where I was back then. But on the way out of the last store, this guy walks up to us and he looks at us and his jaw drops. And he doesn't even pretend that he's not staring at us. And so finally he asks us, "Are y'all in a band or something?" And Manson was just smirking, but I straight-faced just came right out and said, "Yes, we're in a Christian band. It's called Satan on Fire." The guy looked shocked, and you could tell he was upset, and he's just like, "Why do you want to call it that?" And I told him, "Listen, a lot of bands and kids think that the devil is cool, so we're here just trying to reach them and to remind them of where the devil and all his followers are going. They're in fire." And he's like, "Man, I like that. Are you guys playing live?" And of course, I assured him we were, and then I gave him the next time, date, and venue of the next Manson show. And then I felt inspired, so I started creating a series of these flyers using local glam bands, rock and roll bands, and I presented them as Satan on Fire. And I would have this stuff, and I didn't do them nearly as well as Manson, but with the low tech I had at the time, I did them and handed them out to kids saying it was a Christian show, but given the dates for Manson shows. And so Manson then took it a step further and actually created a side project called Satan on Fire that had a demo tape but also they had t-shirts and stuff, so it just kind of took on a life of its own. But let me tell you about the last time that I saw Manson. It was at Peaches, a record store in Fort Lauderdale, and it was a signing event. You see, their new album, their first album, had come out, Portrait of an American Family, and it was the summer of 1994. And he saw me at some point in line, and he laughed. He's like, "Hey, Bill," and he grabs an album. But before I could get to him, he starts signing it, and then he comes over, and I'm like, "Sorry, I'm not actually buying one." And the girl looked a little bit upset, but took it anyway. So somewhere out there, there is an original album signed for me that someone has. So again, sorry about that. But nonetheless, that was the very last time that I saw Manson or spoke to him. And it's been 30 years. So 3 decades later, what would I say if we were to sit across from one another right now and have a conversation? Now, it's highly unlikely that I'll ever see or speak to Manson again, but over the years, I kind of wished that I would run into him, not to ask him for anything or even just to get a selfie, but just to talk. That said, since I probably won't see him again on this side of eternity, let me just share a few things with you that I would say if we were to talk. The first thing I would say is congratulations on all you've been able to accomplish and achieve. I mean, you've earned and achieved success that most of us can only dream of. And I know you worked hard for it. I hope you're able to enjoy it. I know success brings a lot of jealousy, but I celebrate it. I'm glad you were able to accomplish all of those things. Secondly, I would say, I don't condemn you, and neither does God. I know maybe a lot of Christians want me to do this, knowing what they know or thinking what they think about you, and or even some of the allegations that have been made against you. Maybe it's not just Christians, but it's really not my job to condemn you. Look, I know you're dealing with legal issues and charges that are kind of serious, and you'll have to sort that out. But I don't point my finger in judgment at you, because I know there are three more pointing back at me. God knows I've done my share of evil things in this world, and that to this day, I'm far from perfect, and I fall short on a daily basis. You've made a mockery of God and his followers, and you've influenced a lot of people to do the same. But I used to do that too. And what I discovered is God's love is bigger than that too. The third thing I would say is your greatest story hasn't been told yet. And I know that may seem crazy, but if you think about your transformation from a gifted young man to a superstar, that was an amazing transformation. But I believe an even more spectacular transformation awaits you. I know you're hoping for 2024 to be a big comeback, and I wish the best for you. And I've certainly heard about some changes you've made about getting back in shape and maybe a couple years sober now. And if that's true, congratulations. Those are great things, and you must feel amazing compared to before. But again, the greatest transformation you can experience, I believe, is being relationally connected to Jesus. You see, when you put on the makeup, the tats, the Manson persona, I know you transformed into something bigger than Brian, and it must have felt very empowering. But I know that you know that there's a cost to all this. As you say yourself, the hat wears you. But underneath all of that, you were created imago Dei, in the image of God. You still bear that underneath there. It's where your creativity, your artistry, and other good things about you come from. And I believe God wants to do a deep work in you and draw even more of that out of you so you can experience a greater and even more wonderful transformation than you ever have before. You see, in my life, this transformation means change in the way that I think. He's cleared up many of the foundational lies that my life and identity were built on and helped me become just a better version of myself. Not the best version yet, because I'm absolutely still a work in progress. But he keeps working on me, refining me, until more and more of his image is revealed in my life. And in the same way, I can't even imagine what God would have for you, what God could do in you and through you. I mean, look, you've had fame, fortune and all the pleasures that this world has to offer you. And I bet it feels kind of empty sometimes. I bet it feels kind of futile, like something is missing. Some people say money can't buy happiness. I believe it can actually buy a certain amount of happiness, but there are things that none of that can buy. Things like peace, joy, genuine love, stability. And I've come to treasure these things in my life, and I'd love for you to experience those things in your life too. And look, I know you've called out the hypocrisy of Christians, and you're right. We can be awful people sometimes. We can do awful things, say awful things. But I want you to know there's also a great many of us that are actually sincere and trying. And I hope you'll look past some of our shortfalls to see the God that we serve and to see that what he has for you is good. And look, if Manson and I were to sit across from one another today, I'm sure that there are more things that I would say. There's a lot actually I'd want to listen and hear what he would have to say. But those things that I shared are probably the most important things that I would communicate. And look, if you've stuck with me, we're done. Thank you so much for watching this video. But I want you to know those things that I would say to him, they're also true for you. What a trip it's been. I mean, it's certainly uncomfortable as I've re-immersed myself in some of where I was and where I've been. It feels like an old movie that I'm watching, but it was actually a wild and weird and real period of my life. So I appreciate you stepping into this journey and taking it with me, and I hope to see you next time.